welcome to the Beef Edge, the Teagasc Beef Podcast, for all your latest news, information and advice for Irish beef farmers. I'm Catherine Egan, and in preparation for winter in a 3-part series on the Beef Edge, I'll be focusing on the topics nutrition, health and housing. On this episode, I'm joined by vet Cara Sheridan with MSD Animal Health to find out how to manage animal health over the winter. And I first asked Cara, in preparation for housing, what do you advise from an animal health point of view?
So, Catherine, I suppose if there's anyone who's lucky enough that still has cattle out in the land, and I suppose that this weather is definitely going to minimise them, what I would say is if your cattle are yet to be housed, just have a think about it. Are they actually ready for housing? So, especially with regards to first grazing season animals, so whether it's autumn-born calves from last year or spring-born calves from this year, to make sure that they're not carrying a worm burden going into the house. It's relevant for all ages of animals, but that can leave them especially vulnerable to lungworm. And then, of course, lungworm will predispose them to pneumonia, which is the last thing we want. So are the cattle ready for housing? Because it is imminent. And then the other side of it is, are the sheds ready? Are the sheds ready for the cattle? And I know that might sound like a basic thing to ask, but just little things. Have they been washed? Have they been cleaned out since last year? If they haven't, you want to get a wriggle on. Water supply, water drinkers, anything that needs fixing to make sure it's a lot easier to fix these things before the cattle are housed. So to make sure that the houses are ready for the cattle, and to make sure then that the cattle are also ready if they're not already housed for housing.
I suppose, Cara, once the stock are housed, in some cases where stock have been housed a couple of weeks, what do you advise?
So if they're at the point of housing, and again, the weather is going to play havoc with this, but you do your damnedest to try and get them in on a dry day. It does make a massive difference. If they are already housed and just housed in the last few days, well, one big thing when they are housed first is to try and do everything, I suppose, as stress-free as possible. It makes a massive difference to man and beast, to be fair. So to be well set up on the day of housing, and also once they are housed, how are your stocking rates? Are there too many in each pen? Are there just enough? And it's not, there are a lot of rules and regulations for this and guidelines, but like just the simple things. Is there enough feed barrier space? Is there enough room for every animal in there to move around and lie down comfortably? You know, it comes back to basics. If they have been housed and they're being divided into pens, of course, is there any bullying going on? If there are, especially in the first few days, in the first week post-housing, that's when you kind of notice if perhaps you may need to make a few adjustments and switch animals from one pen to the next, all of these things really help to minimise the stress. Then from an animal health point of view, is there any coughing going on? Are there any animals that, aren't well? If they are, the quicker you can act on an animal who doesn't look well to examine them and see what is wrong, you really are doing yourself and the animal a favour to see what is going on. If it's a case that you have sick animals, please just don't feel that you need to, it's probably pneumonia, it's probably this or that. It is worthwhile. This is a time when things can really go wrong, so it is worthwhile maybe getting the vet out to examine and to actually see what is going on. If there's a cough going on in the shed, and we mentioned, if you haven't been able to dose pre-housing, then perhaps this is the time for dosing, especially from the lungworm point of view, from which dose to use and when to use it or exactly how to use it. To speak in broad categories, there are 3 different types of dose for worms. You have the white drench, you have the yellow, and then you have the macrocytic lactones, so the likes of your ivermectins. Depending on the product, depends really on what they treat and how they treat it and how long they treat it for. So if you have calves or yearlings that maybe had a dose back in, way back in the summertime, that dose has long since left their system and is no longer doing anything. If you have animals that were dosed with ivermectins within the last month, then perhaps they're still under cover. So it is worthwhile just seeing what did you use and maybe do I need to consider a dose again. Something as well which are so useful if they're used at the right time are fecal samples, and I suppose we have more exposure to them recently with the BPS scheme, because we would have, from a suckler side of things, we would have been encouraged to use them, but they are really useful to check for worm egg counts. The only time you can get caught out with them is if you're in pre-patent period, and basically what that means is that animals have the worm burden and may not be shedding, or with lungworm it may be difficult to find larvae, but from a standard gutworm point, they are really, really useful. So don't underestimate them. They're not just something to do. They can actually be really useful.
You mentioned there the BPS scheme and the fluke samples that were taken of suckler cows. If farmers had fluke samples sent back before the 1st of October deadline, and they showed that there was no fluke in the system. What advice have you for those farmers?
Okay, so just a positive and a negative, really, what that means from the point of view of liver fluke and rumen fluke. So liver fluke it's an awkward one to catch. So even though animals have liver fluke, they shed intermittently. So a negative fecal sample does not mean that you definitely don't have liver fluke or rumen fluke. They're easier. If they have them, they will shed them. But on the flip side of that, just because they have rumen fluke in their dungs doesn't mean that it's actually significant. So from the liver fluke point of view, and it all depends when the samples were taken. Like you said, Catherine, the deadline was the 1st of October. And I do know from personal experience, a lot of people would have taken them a hell of a lot earlier than that anyway. It may be a case that it is worthwhile taking them again. If you had a positive, it means then that your cows are carrying fluke, so it is worth dosing them. Now, again, if you are to, and it depends, have they clinical signs? In other words, are they scouring? Have they lost condition? Because you have an option here in that, do I treat them now for fluke? Or historically, what we would have been all used to is that you wait until animals are housed 6 to 8 weeks of a minimum before you would dose them for fluke. So you make that call, have a chat with your vet to see, well, do I need to dose them now? Or am I okay to wait? Or is it a case, and we've had a very wet summer on and off, and we've had warm temperatures as well, which parasites absolutely love. They've had a great summer. So it may be a case that you may need to fluke them now, and you may need to fluke them again in 2 months' time, depending on which product you choose to use. So just have that chat out with your vet, but don't. Fecal samples, they need to be interpreted with care. They're very useful, but you need to make sure that you just, I suppose, don't hang your hat on them. A negative doesn't necessarily mean a negative, and a positive doesn't necessarily mean you're in trouble either.
Yes, and it's important to check the withdrawal dates on any of the products that's used, either for the lungworm, gutworm, or the fluke.
Absolutely. If you're using them in cattle that are for fattening, to make sure that you don't catch yourself out there. And there are an array of products, with different withdrawals, so there is generally an option there too. And just with if you are using porons, just to be careful that, especially with regards to withdrawal, that you want to make sure that animals that are for slaughter aren't in close contact with animals that maybe got a poron, because the last thing you want is that they would come in contact with that product accidentally because it's a poron.
Yeah, and I suppose a lot of people will think about the internal parasites, but when it comes to the case of lice, what do you recommend for treating stock at housing or post-housing?
Yeah, so and lice is definitely going to be trouble. I mean, if you see it, we've had a lot of days there recently, and they're in the mid-teens temperature-wise, so lice are going to have a field day when cattle are housed. The reason lice, I suppose, we normally think of it kind of as something that gives issues around Christmas time. It can give issues anytime, especially once cattle are in close proximity, which is what they are when they're housed. As regards what to treat them with, so there's, broadly speaking, there's 2 types of lice. There's biting lice and sucking lice. So the sucking lice will be vulnerable, and they can be killed by a product that is parental, so a product that you would inject. Whereas the biting lice, the ones that are, I always think of it that they're very much on the surface. The only thing that is going to kill them is the likes of a poron or a spot on, so something that's applied externally. Regardless of what you go treating with, I think it's really important that all animals in the shed are treated. It just doesn't work any other way. And don't expect as well to get away with one lice treatment in the winter. We have really mild, really damp winters, and so lice, they give trouble from the beginning of housing really right through until nearly until let out. So it is common practice that animals would have to be treated more than once, maybe even more than twice for lice. And I suppose if you want to hit both the biting and the sucking, a poron or a spot on is your best option.
That's great, Cara. And I suppose for farmers that are purchasing in cattle, how would their health plan differ when they don't know the previous health history of the animal?
Yeah, it certainly makes it harder, and it's the highest risk, I suppose, that we do deal with. What you do, I mean, unless proven otherwise, and unless you have actual proof that animals have been either vaccinated or dosed, I think it's probably best and probably safest to presume that they haven't had anything. And from the point of view of buying in weanlings, well, if they're balling that day, there's a really good chance they were weaned that day as well. So, stress is at its absolute highest. After any animal is bought in, regardless of age, I think the first 24 hours is just to let them settle. I would never go dosing, vaccinating, doing anything with them in that first 24 hours. TLC goes a long way. So if it's an option to put them on a straw bed even better depending on when you buy them in and depending on weather and also facilities and setup, if they can be in an environment where they can be in and out. That is such a help from the pneumonia point of view. Then from a dosing point of view, so the second day they're home, the second full day they're home, that's when you would be inclined to give them a dose. And as we said, Catherine, we're presuming they haven't had anything, so you are going to give them something. Specifically, lungworm is the big risk, I suppose, from a pneumonia point of view. So if it's a case that you give them a dose there and then, that's maybe just going to kill the worms that they have at that point, and then you plan then on follow up in a few months' time with giving them, or even in a few weeks' time, with giving them something that's going to be more comprehensive, that's going to kill all. I think it's very important to treat them gently. From a vaccination point of view, then, again, do nothing with them for the first 24 hours. Only just show them a bit of kindness. The second full day they're home then is when you can start them on a vaccination plan, depending on whether you go the intranasal route or whether you go with an injectable. It makes a massive difference to both them and to your own cattle as well. If it's possible to keep them isolated from the rest of the cattle until they are fully vaccinated, until they've really settled in. I mean, the first 2 to 3 weeks can be quite rocky, as many people will have experienced before. And by isolation, I don't mean it has to be anything fancy, but just a different airspace to your own cattle.
And I suppose that's important as well for the treatment of lice.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you treat them as a sole entity. So any bought-ins, you really get. The last thing you want is for them to introduce anything to your cattle. But likewise, if there are diseases that are endemic in your own cattle, so for instance, if you have IBR in the herd, which we know 75% of herds have, you don't want the bought-in cattle to succumb to this when they meet yours. So if you can get them up and running on vaccination plans, dosing plans, lice plans, and everything before they meet your own cattle, it makes a huge difference.
You mentioned earlier there the importance of dealing with an issue, whether it's an outbreak of pneumonia. Can you just step through what are the steps a farmer would take or what they should do?
So if you have an outbreak of pneumonia, and I suppose what we mean by an outbreak is it doesn't have to be catastrophic. I suppose once I would see that cattle in the shed are getting pneumonia, I would consider that an outbreak. To act quick is a big thing. So as we said, treating the animal and to be able to treat them quick and to either get advice or get your vet out to check. There are different viruses and there are different bacteria and throw lungworm into the mix that can cause pneumonia. So if you can find out exactly what's at the root of it, your treatment can be tailored, and also then you can have a plan for the rest of the cattle. So for instance, if it is a case that it's lungworm behind a pneumonia outbreak in a shed, well then you can antibiotics and everything else. Yes, you're treating the secondary problem, but you're not getting to the root of it. So vets can take nasal swabs, they can take bloods. Even just clinical judgment can mean a lot, because you can be sure that if they're seeing what they're seeing around the country, they probably, a lot of the times, it's the same thing that they can be seeing in different yards. So get the vet out to examine. If you can isolate the sick animal, it means an awful lot for that animal, but it also means an awful lot for the shed and to reduce the spread, because the impact that pneumonia can have, or even the threat of pneumonia in a shed can be massive on Thrive, not alone the amount of animals that can get sick. As well as that, I suppose it's to know what's normal and what's not normal. So in an ideal world, we would want no cases of pneumonia at all, but let's be realistic, these things do happen. But to know when you are in real trouble here. So from a mortality point of view, so a death rate, what would you be expecting to see? Well, as a rule, we all want to see less than 2% deaths at any given stage in farming, and we want to see none. But you certainly, if you're losing animals, it is really time to get help. And then from a sickness point of view, if it is a case like we should all be aiming, and it is in a time when we want to try and use less antibiotics, and we're so well capable of doing this as well, with just a bit of planning and forward thinking. If we're treating any more than 10% of any animals at any given time, there's something amiss here. So if it's a case that you're going in and you're blanket treating everything in the shed, it is overuse of antibiotics. It's affecting their thrive if they're sick anyway, and also it's maybe not the best approach. So to act more on a preventative approach can be the way. Some vaccinations can kind of be used in the face of an outbreak, others can't. So that's something that you need to get advice on. Something else as well, if you do lose animals, to make sure that they go for post-mortem. And I know it can be a chore in the midst of this when things are going wrong in the yard to make a trip to the lab. But a post-mortem will tell you an awful lot about what's going on. And, it really is paramount. If you lose animals, get them for a post-mortem.
I think you hit on it there, Cara, from the point of view of putting a plan in place, in particular for even cows calving from January, February onwards. What should farmers be considering for the plan for calving for next year?
So to always have a plan, it makes a massive difference, and it doesn't have to be fancy. It can just be a few scribbles on a sheet or something in a notebook. So any cows that are going to be calving down in January, February, and I mean we're early November now, so it's not terribly far away. And I know there's been a podcast on nutrition and a lot of advice on that, but just briefly, I mean 6 weeks away from calving, you need to be thinking about dry cow minerals. And if you're vaccinating them with a scour vaccine, you need to make sure that that's in time. So the vaccines would be for giving 12 to 3 weeks pre-calving. So these things can come around quite quick, and having a good plan in place now can mean that things will definitely go smoother in the new year. And I suppose it's learning as well from what has happened in previous times. So learning from last year to plan for now, for the housing season now, or also learning from the season that we're just facing into to make a plan for next year. So if things have gone wrong at a particular point in time, be it if it's with calf scour or if it's with pneumonia at a certain age of animal, history does tend to repeat itself in given individual yards, because not a lot changes. So to learn from when things went wrong and to have a plan in place. So if you got pneumonia in the young calves, is it a case that you need to get them vaccinated then as young calves? And if you got scour, to vaccinate the cows pre-calving, and that's just in simple terms. Hygiene makes a massive difference when we're talking about scour. So to make sure that the houses that were used last year, so the calving pens, have been cleaned out, they're the most important from the point of view of hygiene, and that they've been disinfected with the right disinfectants depending on what was there. Crypto, for instance, takes a particular disinfectant to kill it.
Some great tips and advice, Cara. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Catherine.
That's all for this week's episode, and my thanks to Cara for joining me on the show. Join me next week for the third part of the podcast series, Getting Winter Ready, when I'll be discussing best practice tips for housing requirements. You can catch up on all other shows and interviews from the Beef Veg podcast on the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie, or you can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe so you never miss the show. For all other updates from our beef programme, keep an eye on our Twitter and Facebook pages. Until next time, I'm Catherine Egan, and thanks for listening.